episode 11 of the Austin Real Estate Today radio podcast. My co-host, Perry Henderson, is here with me. It is September 24th. We're almost to the end of September. And I tell you what, Perry, as we'll talk about in the news today, there is no sign of the market slowing down coming into the fall, is there?
No, not at all.
And I think that's interesting for people because historically, even in Austin, you've seen a trend where a lot of people pull their house off the market. They want to wait till next spring. We've talked about this on the last couple of podcasts as far as questions. But if you look at the sales data, certainly the data through August does not show any kind of slowdown. It was actually stronger than July, as we'll talk about. But I'm not seeing it in my business, and I'm sure you're not in yours either, are you?
Not at all. Super busy right now. Very, very energetic. Lots of stuff going on at all different levels, though. Rents, relocation, different people selling their places in other areas, coming into areas that are hard to get to, et cetera.
Absolutely. And we can kind of tie that down for people. You heard Perry talk about the relocation part of the business, which is always a very strong segment of Austin because of the job growth. But you also have the rental market because some people can't sell their properties in their originating markets. So as a result, you've got a market that is extremely tight for rentals, especially what would be considered an executive or family rental market, and extremely tight downtown for rental, like we've talked about. And you combine that with a very low inventory. We talked about it on the Total Market Overview in the last podcast, episode 10. We're sitting at 4 months of inventory. I mean, it's a very low, tight market, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I know, Perry, you saw this article. So the title was, and they'll be linked in the show notes, this article was Austin Home Sales Sizzle in August, Expected to Stay Hot. And this is just a coincident article to us talking about how strong things are. The percent increase in August was up 21%. If you remember the numbers when we reported it about 4 or 5 episodes ago, the July number was up 20%. So this is even stronger in August. I'd be really interested to see what happens with September. I think it's going to be a strong number too. The challenge we have now is less inventory for people to take over, isn't it?
I believe so. It's hard not to say that it isn't.
This is a number that I thought was extremely strong. The median price was up 6% year over year. It's a real big indicator of what we would expect to see in this market, which is if you're in central areas, if you're in the strong portions we've talked about throughout every episode of the podcast, in other words, you're not on the Lago Vista or far side of the lake, you're not way out past Spicewood, you're in the corridors where the employment can service it from a commuting standpoint. In other words, you're not too far out. The markets are tight everywhere, aren't they?
Absolutely.
And that's showing up in the median price. 6% year-over-year increase is a really strong increase. Here's the number that I found surprising, the $212,000 median price. It's the highest number they've recorded in August in a decade.
Wow.
So if you go back, and for those of you that remember what happened from 1999 to 2001, and Perry, you probably remember this, this was the whole boom period for Austin that came out of the dot-com boom.
Yeah, with the 5-step marketing strategy, you step out of your car, 5 steps later, you have a sale.
Yeah, and it was driven primarily by speculation related to the technology companies and a never-ending flora of people with equity that was being cashed out because the IPO market was on fire or buying houses. I can tell you, I came out of Silicon Valley in the 1997 period through 99. I bought a very large piece of property on Lake Austin, and I paid cash for it. And it was part of that speculative boom. And look at this. It took us a decade plus to get back to where we are, and now we're sitting here with a little over 4 months of inventory. It's a very interesting number to me, isn't it to you?
Absolutely it is. Please keep going. Please keep going.
15th consecutive month of year-over-year increases in sales volume. That is probably the most important number out of everything in here. Because what happens with real estate markets, because real estate is local, we're going to talk a little bit about the national numbers because they're strong too, but the local number, if it increases year over year consecutively and the volumes are building, volume drives price in real estate. It's a supply and demand factor. We've talked about the fact that it takes a much longer period of time, whether you're talking about rental inventory or purchase inventory, because we do have a decent segment of this market that's driven by new construction. And that was restricted for years because of the crash in the real estate market. But because we are a jobs-driven market, which is the next bullet point, we're seeing year-over-year increases. And what's happening is we're actually probably below where we could be because of a lack of inventory. You have the haves and have-nots. Pretty much the only properties that are not selling now in this market are ones that are so grossly overpriced that it should be malpractice for an agent to take them. I mean, I see some of these things. You see them too. They come out and you're looking at the pricing and going, okay, it's never going to appraise, let alone sell for that price. And then they don't sell. And then the one will come in around the corner and they'll get 15 offers on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I expect there's only two things that can derail this real estate market. One would be a downturn in the economy that would affect the job market overall, because remember, we have a heavy immigration. People have to come from other places. You know, we'll still probably be better than the country, even if the country takes a negative turn for jobs. A lot of this is hinging on what's going on in November. What I think is the wild card here, Perry, and I'm just going to put this down, I'll earn my next drink with this bet with you, is we could see a little moderation here in September through November as people take a pause, waiting to sort of see and measure what's going to happen. Although I think we're going to get a pretty big indicator that the first debate's in another week in Denver. But it could cause it to be a pause. And we don't have a lot of inventory for people to pick over. So some people may be just deciding to wait and look in the spring, don't you think, as a buyer?
I think you see a normal little surge of that every year. You see the people that come in and do a little waiting. Either their kids are in school. You know, we've talked about this the last couple episodes. But in reality, you've got to just be on a watch all the time, especially in key areas. And we've talked about this over and over again.
Well, and it's absolutely critical when you look at success for people to understand the dynamic of Austin. You know, we talked about this in the questions of missing out, working with agents that you may think are a great agent. And one of our questions today is about this, is how to pick the right agent to work with. Let's transition to the next article. Then I want to kind of give away what the question is later in the podcast. But there's a large builder, and you've seen him in the news several times, and you probably recognize his name, out of Canada, out of Ottawa, I think. And there's the Canadian builder. They announced an 1,800-acre subdivision in San Marcos.
Wow.
Over 2,600 homes. It's right near Highway 130, where it comes in on the south bypass for the Austin metro area.
Right.
I think you're going to see a lot of growth down there. And they're also planning a big project near the outlet malls, which is a little bit further up. But we're going to start to see continued interest, especially if somebody is outside of the normal funding model, meaning that North American builders in the U.S. that are stock market driven have metered up their building, but they really haven't turned it on. Last week we talked about KB Homes starting to build, and this is another project yet again from another large builder out of Canada. I think we're going to start to see this type of an announcement. Again, it's a multi-year process. We talked about KB Home being a 10-year build out there in Leander last week. Anybody who's going to build 2,600 large lot homes in San Marcos, you're probably talking about that's a 5 to probably more likely 10-year build out. The market won't absorb that many houses anyways. But
and how long do you think a project like that takes to start up too, Kevin?
Well, I think the challenge with any projects, and this is just a comment on building, I remember in the 2004 through 2005 period when Austin was getting a lot of interest from outside investors because they were cashing out of the boom markets on the coasts. People were coming in and snapping up anything they get as far as new construction. Investors were. And so what happens is these builders work on these long cycle projects, and they got to make a bet that's a decade-long bet. I mean, you go like Coffin Road, you're going to do 1,000-plus homes, and Walton's going to do 2,600-plus homes. And you're talking about a build-out that could take a decade. And so they're having to build, and this to me is bullish on the economy here in central Texas around Austin, that people are willing to take these giant bets on the economy.
It's a good bet right now.
Go ahead.
It's a good bet right now.
Absolutely.
I saw something earlier this week that said 3.8% in unemployment this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is Central Texas and Texas in general, we've talked about this several podcasts ago, is bucking the trend on jobs. Here's some national news from Forbes where they're talking about, whether they're going to call a housing recovery nationally based on housing starts and sales of existing homes. And it hits a 2-year high. Well, this is interesting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but what was interesting is that last bullet point there. The distressed share falls to 22%. That's the lowest it's ever been since they started really tracking those numbers. Wow. The market crashed. And so it's been as high as almost 40% at times. And so that's down by half from where it was before. And we were talking about an annualized rate of, as high as 5 million plus. Now it's 4.82 million units. Even if you take 20% of that number, that's a lot of distressed property.
Yes, it
Imagine
is.
when it's at 40%. That changes the dynamics. And how for those listeners wondering how this affects Austin, if this number continues at this low percentage, this distress number, I see that having a bigger effect on the market because we've got a large embedded buyer pool that are sitting in homes renting because they couldn't sell their house at home. When the market improves to the point where they sell them, they become our next wave of buyers. And I think when you look at these houses that are leased, they're typically leased by somebody who's got a home behind, or there's some other extenuating circumstance. There aren't very many people that are sort of coming into Austin and they're not certain that Austin's going to sustain a strong growth. The answer I hear more frequently is, I've leased because I have a house back in Virginia or California and I couldn't sell it.
Right.
This has the biggest swing on that. Here's one that's near and dear based on our podcast last week to you and your clients. The real estate industry welcomes changes, and this is an Inman News article on FHA condo rules. I don't know if you had a chance to look through all these rules, but this is huge, isn't it?
It's a lot better for the buyer. And what that means to the average buyer is the difference of a, say, 3.8% interest rate versus a 4.5% interest rate, or 4.75. I think you can afford a little bit more house that way.
Well, I think the practical reality is, and we didn't touch on this as much last week on the podcast, and we can do this if we get one of our financing experts in. One of the things that buyers find out really quickly is if you're using FHA financing, you're going to hear the word of a warrantable or non-warrantable condo, or the project is certified or not. And what this does is it changes the liability rules. And this is probably the biggest thing I saw in here, where if I'm the condo association and I'm a member or board member on the association, it used to be they had to warrant and certify things that they really didn't have a whole lot of control over. And as a result, many, many of them would not agree to the FHA terms, and as a result, they weren't eligible for that financing. So what it did was it took a vehicle for financing that would have opened the market up for many additional buyers and for condos, and just took them out of the market. And talk about the difference. You do a conventional loan on a non-FHA project, or you're talking about minimum of 20% down typically, aren't you?
Absolutely. I've seen 10% for excellent credit. 7, 20.
But that's not the norm. I mean, certainly the average buyer listening to this should be planning on 20% unless they get pre-approved through a lender that tells them that their situation warrants less. Now, FHA, you're talking 3.5%.
That's right.
And you're talking about a whole different world and a much larger buyer pool. Now, historically, the problem with condos has been that the majority of the projects have backed away from it because of this liability issue. And the second thing that hurt the market is the part that I don't know that it really had as big an effect here in Austin. I'll ask you this question, is they made a huge change as well into the investor percentage. They took it all the way down to 10% on the cap of the number of units that could be owned by a single investment entity. And they also had a cap on what percentage of the units in total could be owned by investors. And they took all this stuff and they adjusted it. And it's in the range of 50% now. And I don't know whether that's been a big issue here in the market in Austin, but certainly in other parts of the country it's been a huge issue.
Well, with all the good rental rates that we're getting right now, I've seen project after project. Let me give you an example. 1510 West 6th Street over there at 6 West Lynn. So those the rental rates are so high now, and they may not want to sell their property yet. They just take the extra income and cash flow on the property. You have people who were owner-occupied shifting to an investor status, so it was, at one time, owner-occupied over 50%. Now it may be 45% owner-occupied and the other rented. That's the challenge that I see in a couple smaller projects in downtown Austin.
Well, and I think this will be an issue that gets addressed over time. Now, and this is not a political comment, but depending on what happens in November, this could continue to accelerate because the Democratic Party is always in the party that attempts to push homeownership to a higher level because they want that to be part of the American dream and they want it to be at a higher level. If you look at where we are now, because of the pendulum, we're at a 50. That's a 50 low for ownership. That's well below where it probably needs to settle. One of the ways you fix that is with the FHA. We talked about in previous podcasts the fact that the Fed, or the Federal Reserve, is pumping the mortgage channel with $40 billion for the foreseeable future per month. So I think you're going to see some interesting things going to happen in finance and the mortgage side. But like we talked about in the past couple of weeks, this is a challenge that's a 18 to 24-month swing, meaning you and I will be talking about this on episode 100 probably, that significant changes have changed the mortgage market and the homeowner.
For sure.
I expect at episode 50, not even 100, that you and I will be talking about the homeowner percentage going up, not down, unless something really dramatic happens with the marketplace.
Well, I hope so.